And first of all, thank you to the Nordic and Baltic team that has made this conference possible. I'm very honored to be invited here. I agreed, I think I will share my slides here. I agreed with the organizers for title called Danish Teacher Education, Blending National, Nordic and European Inspirations, as a way of maybe giving you insights into how debates and how developments in Danish teacher education is taking place. First of all, maybe I should say that my background is, of course, I'm a professor now of educational science at the Danish School of Education, but I have a background as a teacher educator and also as a school teacher, so has a lot of passion there, and is currently also the president of the Nordic Educational Research Association. And here I would like to say to our Baltic colleagues that at the time being, we are having discussions with our Scottish and Irish research colleagues in educational research about extending the Nordic dimension to more collaboration with them, which they have been very interested in. And we are very welcoming to also colleagues from Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia. So please reach out if you have interest. Anyway, as a researcher, and I think this is a good conference because it brings together different stakeholders in school and teacher education. And I would say, as a researcher with the passion of having been a school teacher and a teacher educator and now being in research, I think asking the question about teacher education and good teacher education needs an initial appeal for reflection. Because on the one hand, research tells us that the quality of teachers sets the limits for the quality of our schools. But this also requires us to reflect a little upon the question, what is really the purpose of school? And what do we really mean when we utter the word quality? Is the purpose of school to produce the coming workforce? Is it to produce the good citizen that can contribute to the social cohesion of the country, the good life of the country? Is it producing good parents, or is it to produce the happy life? And how do you balance these very legitimate interests in economic growth on one hand, and maybe social cohesion and individual development on the other hand? And are they necessarily contradictory to each other? You could ask yourself the very important question too, I think, which we often forget. Is cultural tradition a purpose in itself for the life within a community and its relations to its surrounding world? Or is education rather an asset, a means for something else? And I think that something that is very important to discuss when you talk about teacher education and school is how the coming of what you call the competition state and the knowledge economy, how that increasingly affects how we can talk about school and teacher education. You could say that the very important and very leading, I think, transnational organizations, the OECD and the EU, we should remember that they are not educational organizations. They have grown up as organizations mainly to further economic development. Even with the Bologna process, you can ask, what does it mean that the European Commission has increasingly become the coordinating factor of the Bologna process? And you could ask, if you were a little more tense, how did we come into this strange situation where basic education of our kids in their most formative years is placed in a privileged relationship to the economy? I think these are very important questions, so that we do not just take for granted the situation that we are currently in. And then, of course, you come to the next question. As you can see, I don't think you can talk about teacher education without firstly asking yourself the question, what is the purpose of school? Because teacher education obviously needs to have a relationship to school somehow. But nonetheless, from a Danish context, from a Nordic context, I would say from decades of debates and work within this area, that you also need to ask yourself the question, is teacher education an end in itself, or is it a preparation for a job position? And how should these ends be balanced? What constitutes the good teacher? The reason why I'm asking this is because Danish teacher education has moved from defining the teacher, if you should put it on the edge, as 50% personal development on one hand, and then 50% academic competence on the other hand, to a situation where academization and a more focus on academic subjects have become much more dominant. So what constitutes the good teacher? Is it the academic knowledge? Is it the expert of academic knowledge that constitutes the good teacher? Is it didactic skills? Is it relational competences with young people and children in their very formative years? Or is it a question more broadly about a person of human integrity? So that was the appeal for initial reflection. I think that you can never stop when you talk about school and teacher education, and that should always be there behind, so that we do not turn means into the end, which I think is often a danger. So if you talk about Danish teacher education, I think it would make sense to think of Danish teacher education as a blending of national traditions and European transnational inspirations, and the wonderful mediation that often happens there via the Nordic collaborations, which I think is a beautiful area for gaining a critical mass, I think, in discussing very, very essential questions for nation building and for the future of our children. If you talk about the national tradition here in this blending between national Nordic and European inspirations, if you think about Danish teacher education there, I would say that up till around 2000, let's take that as a changing year when the Bologna process was launched, the seminary tradition was very dominant in Denmark and the other Scandinavian countries, at least. And here in a Danish context, you could say that the tradition from Grundtvig, the famous Enlightenment person of the mid-19th century, who talked a lot about that learning or school is for life, and life is not for school, to put it up a little in little oppositionary terms, and that the living word should be governing for school in order to ignite the passion for learning of the children. Then again, reform pedagogy in its many ways has also been very, very dominant in Danish teacher education up till around 2000, and still plays a role. Of course, with the point of departure in the child and leading also to a lot of emphasis on project-based education, where you take point of departure in problems that are defined by children or young people. And that leads to the third inspiration of the seminary tradition, which has been very dominant also. We had the great thinker of a legal background, Hal Koch, who was writing in the 30s when fascism was rising in Europe, and was writing also about the situation of school after the 1950s, or after the World War II. And he has been the icon of the idea that school should be a microcosm of society, so to speak. That school is a place, this idea that school is a place where children from families from all walks of life, all forms of ethnicities today, social groups, where they meet each other and learn citizenship as a practical endeavor, where they learn tolerance, meeting the other, and where they learn democracy. And you can say these traditions have been very much inspired by German didactics and the Bildung tradition that I'm sure you know, and has been very much positioned up against Anglo-American curriculum and standards-based education models. Of course, Danish teacher education has also been inspired by American thinking like Dewey, progressivism, and also Ralph Tyler and this curricula and educational technology thinking. I'm putting the things a little on the edge for a short presentation. And you could say that currently in Denmark, the research struggles around teacher education and educational research is very much like it also is in Sweden and Norway. I know the struggle between pedagogic, which cannot really be translated into English. Some people try with pedagogy, but it's not quite the same. Pädagogik, this often German-inspired tradition, to educational research. And that is also, what would you call it, a movement from this seminary tradition, from this pedagogic tradition, towards a tradition also where school effectiveness and you could say the aspects of transnational collaborations fill up more and more. So you could say that Danish teacher education is very much in a limbo right now, or in a transitionary period, which you can also see in it that we've had 4 reforms in only 30 years. 1991, 97, 2006, and the latest in 2012, 13. And most likely we will see a lot more. And that means that in the last 30 years, we've probably had pretty much as many reforms as we've had since the 19th century, up till 1991. And the current key questions in the Danish context in relation to teacher education right now is the question whether teacher education should be elevated from university college status to university status. And of course, also upon the enlightening Finnish presentation from Jari, there's the discussion inspired by Finland also, whether it should be moved from its current professional bachelor's status to a master's education. And it's also very much discussed what the relation should be of teacher education to research and development work. I'll come a little more to that in a few minutes. So you could say that the effects of school reform has also had a lot of impact upon how we discuss teacher education. And we've had this tradition after 2000, you could say, after the so-called Togo shock and the PISA shock. I will explain that in a couple of minutes. We've had a transition towards more academization in this particular and very school effectiveness inspired way towards what we call the goal-directed school, which in an international terminology basically means that standards-based education with systematic evaluation and national tests has increasingly become a fact in Danish school. Second trajectory is the Nordic. And then, of course, you come to the question, what is the Nordic dimension? And I'm sure when you are at Nordic conferences like Nordic Educational Research Association, we every year we usually have a conference with around 700 educational researchers from all the Nordic countries, and hopefully in the future more from the Baltic countries as well. And if you ask researchers there, what is the Nordic dimension? Usually they agree that there is a Nordic dimension, but when you ask them to define it, they often become short of words. So the Nordic dimension has a little of an opaque dimension. On the one hand, you have institutionalized Nordic collaboration like the Nordic Council, which is important in this context also. And like this Nordic conference, you have NERA, Nordic Educational Research Association, and so on. But then you also have a huge undergrowth of formal and informal collaborations of all kinds, going all the way down to friendship towns between a Danish town and a Finnish town and a Swedish town, and so on and so forth. But anyway, the Nordic dimension is a way of putting into speech this kind of collaboration. And usually we can agree upon terms like the welfare states, the social democrat built welfare states, you could say, social and gender equity, also terms that are often put forward as strongly Nordic. But then again, also in relation to educational comparison, you could say that history has made us mutually the first comparison choice. You could say that for centuries we have been killing each other and collaborating with each other. As you know, the Danish flag fell down from heaven while trying to conquer Estonia in 1219. And Sweden, during the time of Charles IX in around 1600, tried to conquer the Baltic states as well. And then when the Nordic states became more, what would you call it, didn't have these big power or superpower aspirations anymore in the 19th century, you got Scandinavism and Nordic collaboration in more peaceful ways. Anyway, what does that have to do with current teacher education? Well, in a Danish context, we used to think that we had the world's best school, which of course mirrors that before the 90s, we had a tendency to look inward towards our own school system. But then we got the Togo shock in 1991. That was when this IEA literacy test of the fourth grade students showed us that Danish students apparently were reading at mediocre levels. What especially took us by surprise was that we were way below the other Nordic countries. And that led to an increasing Nordic collaboration in the sense that we wanted to, and that's what we still want to when we looked to PISA and to IEA comparisons, that the first comparison choice, if you follow the Danish or the Nordic debates, Scandinavian debates, is that we compare us to the other Nordic countries and how we're doing in relation to them. That's why also after the Togo shock, you had the North reading research projects and so on to find out how we could become better in literacy. And you could say that what changed from before to after 2000 is that generally the discourse before was that Sweden and Denmark were the progressive school systems that the world were looking up to, and we had a lot of visitors and things like that, and that Finland, to put it a little on the edge, were a little behind. But after PISA, we learned that this became lopsided, that Finland suddenly was the excellent country, and Sweden and Denmark were below average, and increasingly went to Finland to learn. Then we come to the third turn and the last turn, which is the European transnational turn. Here, of course, you have four giants, where the real big giants, of course, are the OECD and the EU, and the smaller giants are the Bologna process and the IEA. And here, teacher education, as well as school policy, has increasingly become the object of comparability, which increasingly becomes a kind of soft power whereby we make our school systems and teacher education systems comparable. You also see an increasing output orientation in terms of thinking of competences and focus on evaluation and tests. But it often happens at a level where you, so to speak, and that's the danger of these comparative obsessions somehow, that the good thing is that it opens your horizon and takes away your focus of only looking at yourself and thinking you have the best school system, and then open your eyes to being able to learn from others. But the danger is that you often take very complex national contexts and decontextualize them into a number. And then you put that number into a ranking, and then you use the rankings as the point of departure for discussing quality, which I think is very dangerous. And I agree with colleagues who are doing IEA studies and PISA studies that PISA and IEA studies cannot be used for ranking. They can be used for seeing whether some countries seem to do some things better or not, and then be used as inspiration maybe to go to that country and see if they do something there that you actually can use to improve what you want to do with your own school system or teacher education system. Anyway, my time is running short. This transnational turn, which really took speed, momentum in the 90s and after 2000, has also transformed the meaning of what the Nordic dimension means. Because where Nordic collaboration previously happened very much from one Nordic country to the other Nordic country, it happens very much now by detour over the Bologna process, the OECD, PISA, and IEA studies, in the sense that much of educational debate in Nordic countries today, we still look to each other as the first comparison choice, because the contexts are comparable in many ways, not the same, but comparable. But we very much do these comparisons now via the transnational collaboration studies. All right, coming to the end. Europe, the Nordic Effect, and Danish teacher education in a new age. You can ask yourself, is Denmark, the Nordic latecomer in teacher education, lagging behind? Well, you can certainly say that the transnational turn has had a lot around schools and PISA and so on, has had a lot of effects on teacher education. We've had some OECD country reports. In particular, there was one in 2004 on the evaluation culture in Danish school, which was an OECD report with a lot of impetus from school effectiveness representatives. which came to the conclusion that Danish educational research was that Danish school evaluation culture was too unsystematic. And therefore, we didn't get enough out of our investments in Danish school. And that became kind of a leverage for making a much more systematic evaluation culture in Danish school. For instance, it also broke the taboo of testing in school, which had hitherto been a taboo, except for the school ending exam. Now we have 10 national tests in Danish school. Well, actually, they're on suspense right now because we found out they can only be used for comparing schools and municipalities, but that they are not very good for the ongoing work between teachers and individual students. Anyway, the Bologna process has meant a lot because it's put a new agenda for how we can discuss teacher education. And that has been a problem for Danish teacher education, because Danish teacher education was probably the Nordic teacher education program that kept longest to the seminary tradition. And that means that we are looked upon in a Bologna logic as lagging behind. Of course, lagging behind Finland, where teacher education was already made a master education course in 1979. In Iceland, it happened in 2008, and in Norway in 2017, and in Sweden, you have a mixture of bachelor and master's programs in teacher education, but they're all research-based. Whereas in Denmark, in 2000, you got this professions bachelor education, which was not research-based, but which was required to be linked to research. That meant that the university colleges didn't do research by themselves, but they were required to collaborate with universities. That is gradually changing now, and university colleges are increasingly doing research, mostly applied research. And there's a big struggle there, which kind of traditions that research should be based on. Should it be based on empirical research? Should it be tilting towards school effectiveness inspirations, or should it draw on also the Germanic traditions that were usually there? That's a painful tradition that is still taking place and well worth discussing. And then you got the 2012 Act, which had very much focus on how to increase teacher education status, because opposed to what Jari was telling us about in Finland, teacher education status is rather low in Denmark. And you could say that pretty much most people who apply get into the teacher education, which is a problem for the teacher reputation. So now we have a Bologna process act also with a very much focus on output and what we call it, determining what should be learned in teacher education in terms of competences. So, the last thing is just in summary, is to what I've been saying here is that what makes a good teacher and what makes a good school, that's a never-ending cultural struggle. And I think that is very important to keep in mind in transnational or international collaboration. And you could ask, is the tide turning, or are we just seeing a bump in the road in relation to standards-based education? You can see in Denmark from 2016, testing is increasingly questioned as setting too much the agenda for what is happening in school, especially in lower, in the final school years of lower secondary education. You could say that Bildung is increasingly back in school and playing kindergarten. And in relation to teacher education in a Danish context, the question is, will teacher education become fully integrated part of the university, or fully academized? And the question is, would that be desirable? Continuous reform will probably continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I find it very interesting and refreshing, especially, you know, when we are able to compare, you know, your experiences, Danish experiences with Finnish experiences, and to see that you are also, you know, sometimes thinking and struggling what to do. So it brings a lot of issues close to home here as well. So that was John Benedicto Krejsler, who works at Aarhus University. So now we have about 15 minutes for discussion. And for those in the Slido platform, I would like to ask your questions early, you know, so you can post it right away so that I can ask them. Because it happened with Jari that I got questions a bit late, and then I haven't noticed them at the very last minute and didn't post them. So I'll try to kind of reformulate them and ask in the Danish context as well. But first, I was intrigued a little bit about this rather, as you were mentioning, rather low status of teachers, and that those who apply get in. What are the results of that? Because I assume it was like this early as well, when Danish, well, school system was considered sort of the envy of the world. So what happened? I mean, has the system changed? What has changed in your mind that all of a sudden now you're, you know, have, you know, you consider some changes and look at it as a problematic practice?
Yeah, well, I think teacher education has always, in the Danish context, been, what would you call it? It has had a problematic status, or at least for the last 50 years, in the sense that previously, when teacher education was more, you could say, a blend of personal development and academic focus, there was always the question whether teachers were, what would you call it, professionals who didn't really know about their subjects. And they were always questioned because in public debate in Denmark, school has always been something that everybody has an opinion about, because everybody has gone to school. And it is an important part of nation building in Denmark, to this ongoing discussion about where school, which direction a school should go. So everybody has an opinion about teachers. And of course, it's changed over the years. In the 70s, when you had the youth struggle and all the rebellions and things like that, there was a big criticism of teachers of being far too ideologic, and they were losing prestige there among a lot of the population. But today, the problem with teachers, of course, is getting what we call it, ammunition from relatively mediocre, not too good, but better in the last year's results in the comparisons. And that kind of that critique spurs continuous debate about reform of teacher education. But you still have the problems that you have a very, very big part of teachers who start teacher education who leave before they're finished, or who decide not to teach in school. And
Do I understand it correctly that in the Danish system, you can actually become a teacher either going through the university path or through the university college path, right? Those are kind of two colleges and universities are two different paths for getting your teacher career, or am I missing something here?
Sorry, maybe I was not clear enough, but there's only one path, basically.
Okay.
There's all other paths, but the 99% path is the university college path, and that's basically the path that most people, most students go through. And it's been, then you have also a merit-based one that came into effect in the early 2000s, but that's for very few students.
Okay.
That already have another university major. They can have it in 2 years.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Now, so then I assume differently from Finland, then those who actually get into the studies and want to become teachers, then they study both pedagogical studies or educational sciences together with their, for example, subject matter, I don't know, mathematics or something like that. Is that correct?
That's right. It's all, well, one thing I should say before is that there's a big debate about whether universities should be able to make a master level teacher education. That's been debated for about 5, 7, 8 years, but nothing has happened until now. But
okay.
To your question, yes, Danish teacher education is kind of, what would you call it, holistic in the sense of having what we call it, educational subjects and disciplinary subjects.
Okay.
That link them together.
Okay.
But there's been a development where the educational subjects, pedagogic and psychology and so on, general didactics is becoming less and less, and that the disciplinary subjects, reading, literacy, and numeracy in particular, is becoming bigger and bigger.
Are these sort of performance on PISA and other tests, is that driving this kind of concern or this refocus?
Definitely, that has definitely been very much the driver towards a particular idea of what disciplinary knowledge is. That means that if you see the different reforms of teacher education, I mentioned 4, the clear thing now is that literacy and numeracy, that is, it's called Danish and mathematics, are the very big subjects. They are the only 2 subjects that actually are separated into 2 subjects in teacher education. That is literacy from grade 1 to 6, I think, and from 7 to 9. That is 2 different subjects. And numeracy in the same kind of division. That kind of shows how much the idea of thinking the totality of academic subjects in school has been influenced by what is measured by PISA and IEA, Pearls and Tims.
Okay. I also assume probably that the whole evaluation business that you were mentioning, or evaluation culture rather, that you were mentioning, also partly to blame maybe for what is, for what has happened probably in these tests. But what is your assessment of this evaluation culture that has risen and now is, trying sort of to survive or under attack? Has it produced any results in Denmark? Have you looked at this sort of effects of the evaluation culture? Has it helped? Has it not helped? Not just in terms of sort of whether we compare, one school to another, but in more general sense, whether it actually helped to perform better for students, to actually catch their, problems early stages, and plug the holes.
I think this development has been like Yeah, it has had a lot of its teenage problems, you could say. I think that most people would agree today that that a more systematic evaluation culture was probably necessary. And it has produced a more, what would you call it, systematic way of detecting students with development problems or academic problems, and therefore being able to spot it on and to do something about it. In that sense, I think most people would agree that it was a thing that needed to be done. But on the other hand, I think, and that's why I refer to the teenage problems, that somehow this idea of a standards-based school controlled by or by systematic evaluation somehow ran amok, in the sense that up around 2011 to 15, you had up till more than 3,000 competence, knowledge, and skills, goals and sub-goals were required and mandated in a taxonomic system from grade 1 up till grade 9.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
And that became a little too much, I think. For
yeah, it sounds like it's too much.
and that's been a lot of it has now been made not mandatory, but something that you can be inspired by. So there's been a balancing period now.
Okay, excellent. I'll ask one more. There is one question that I'll try to reply. It just came in. Let me see if I can translate. Oh, it's just a sort of a comment that in Danish schools, pupils and students are learning a lot about sort of democracy and democratic sort of values, and that Danish kids love their teachers and the school, and when if somebody removes you like two days, if you get sort of removed from school, I assume it's a big punishment. That's how this comment reads. Is it true? Or do in general Danish students, pupils enjoy school? Is it, does it have sort of, maybe teachers don't have a very high esteem in the society as a whole, but maybe kids just love school?
Yeah, it's one of the things in relation to Finland, that we're always behind Finland, but in one place the Danes kind of are happy when it comes to international surveys, and that is that the Danish students are more happy to go to school than Finnish students. And you could say that also in ICCS, this democracy and citizenship survey of the IEA, you could say that Denmark and Finland came on top, and that was presented in the Danish public as Danish students are world champions of democracy. But on the other hand, you also find out from the same IEA study that apparently Danish students have a lot of knowledge about democracy and citizenship, but apparently they're not very active in using it. So it's all very contradictory.
It's all, I don't know, whichever American president said that, please give me a one-handed economist, rather than on one hand, on the other hand. But one last question, and then we'll wrap up. It relates to sort of further professional advancement for school teachers. What kind of opportunities are there? What can they sort of, what is the system there for in Denmark? If you can sort of quickly look at, post-educational degree, what is the system for keeping, teachers up to date for their own personal development, professional development?
Mm-hmm. I think Denmark has put a lot of emphasis, not only for teachers, but in general, they are very high on what would you call it, on lifelong learning and courses throughout life. But you could say that previously, before Bologna, teacher education was what you called a dead end in Bologna terms. You know, that the seminary education did not allow you to go on to taking a master's course, for instance. Then you needed to have a lot of bridge building courses and things like that to be allowed for that. But with Bologna, teacher education has become a professions bachelor, which allows you to take to go onwards with some master courses in related fields like psychology or education and things like that. And then from there on to take a PhD. But it's all kind of woven into the particular transitionary state of Danish teacher education that it is kind of lagging behind in Bologna terms, in the sense that I think in 2007, only 7% of teacher educators at the university colleges had a PhD degree. And in 2018, that has risen to 13%, and that is well below the other Nordic countries. So you could say that because we hung on to the seminary model for much longer, where personal development and things like that was very important, Grundtvig and so on, it has also kind of made the transitionary period for education after teacher education a little more difficult.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor John Benedicto Krejsler.